I spent the night with two widowed. What they did to me was shocking. The rain was merciless that night, pounding against the wooden planks of the old town as if it sought to wash away every sin and secret buried there. I had just stepped out of the saloon when I saw them. Two women, their dresses clinging tight to their bodies under the storm, eyes burning with something more dangerous than the lightning flashing above. They weren't strangers. Everyone in town knew them. Widows. Each had buried a husband, each carrying a sorrow the whiskey and the cards in the saloon never could cure. One of them, the younger, walked toward me with her white dress soaked, the fabric nearly transparent, shoulders trembling not from the cold but from whatever storm was raging inside her. The other stayed close behind, her black dress hugging her curves, her hand steady on the younger woman's arm as if guiding her. Behind them stood a man with a hat pulled low, a cigar glowing in his mouth, and a pistol resting lazily at his side. He didn't move, didn't speak. He only watched, and in his silence, I felt the weight of what was about to unfold. By the time we reached the saloon again, the lamps flickered inside, casting a warm glow against the rain-streaked windows. The younger widow pushed me through the door, and the smell of tobacco, spilled whiskey, and sweat wrapped around us. She led me straight to the poker table. Cards were scattered, a game left unfinished. I remembered her husband sitting there once, full of life, full of arrogance, only to fall days later by a bullet not meant for him. Now she sat in his chair, her hands brushing the cards as though the game never ended, as if he might still be sitting across from her. She dealt the cards without speaking, her eyes locked on mine. Each flick of the deck was like a test, each glance daring me to fold. The other widow poured whiskey into my glass, her red lips twisting in something between a smile and a warning. I drank, though I knew better. The whiskey burned hotter than the storm outside, and it wasn't long before the cards turned into something more than a game. They were confessions, silent exchanges of grief, hunger, and revenge. But beneath it all lay something heavier, debt, the kind no man could shake. Papers lay scattered across the table in the dim light of the oil lamp. I leaned closer, the words leaping out at me: overdue taxes, unpaid loans, red stamps bleeding across every page. One of them whispered, $800. The sound of it was a death sentence in that town. No rancher, no widow, no farmer could survive owing that much. Her hands trembled as she pointed at the seal, and I realized the truth. Their husbands hadn't just died from fate or violence. They had been buried under the weight of debt and the men who collected it. And then I saw him. The man in the long black coat, flanked by his gunmen, stepping through the doors with the kind of authority that didn't need words. His eyes swept across the saloon, landing on the widows and then on me. I'd seen his type before, the kind who thrived on others' ruin, who made fortunes from foreclosures and bloodshed. The younger widow stiffened, her hand on my shoulder. The older one set her whiskey down, her face hard as stone. She owes, the man growled, his voice low but carrying through the room. His fingers brushed the butt of his revolver like it was an extension of his will. She's not alone, I said before I could stop myself. The words were out, sharp and reckless, but in that moment, with both women at my side, I couldn't let the silence condemn them. The room tightened, cards lay abandoned. The storm outside roared against the walls, as though daring us to match its fury. The widows didn't flinch. They moved closer, one pressing against my left, the other against my right, their warmth cutting through the chill of fear. And I understood then what it meant to stand between them. They weren't asking for pity. They weren't asking for mercy. They were demanding vengeance, a chance to claw back what had been stolen from them. The man in black smirked, his hand finally gripping his gun. But he wasn't fast enough. The widows had already planned it, rehearsed it in silence through every sleepless night since their husbands' deaths. The younger widow grabbed my revolver from my belt, her hand steady despite the storm in her chest. The older one reached under the table, pulling free a hidden derringer I hadn't known she carried. In the flash of an instant, the room exploded with gunfire. Smoke filled the saloon, and the man in black dropped to the floor, his men falling just as quickly. The echoes of the shots rattled the glass, mingling with the thunder outside. My heart pounded, not from fear but from something far deeper, something that bound me to those women in blood and fire. When the smoke cleared, the widows stood tall, their eyes burning not with grief anymore, but with victory. The dead lay forgotten on the table, soaked in whiskey and ash. They had turned the game around, rewritten the story with bullets instead of cards. That night, I stayed with them. Not because I had to, but because I couldn't walk away. They pulled me into their world, a place where loss and vengeance and desire were tangled so tightly they could never be separated. And what they did to me, what they awakened inside me, was nothing short of shocking. It wasn't just passion, though there was plenty of that, raw and unrelenting. It was the way they claimed me, the way they made me theirs as if I had been a piece of the plan all along. By the time the rain stopped and the dawn broke over the town, I knew the truth. I hadn't saved them, they had saved themselves. And me, I was just the man who walked into their storm and never walked back out. The morning after the storm broke over the valley in pale streaks of gold and gray, the town felt different, quieter, though the silence was heavy, as if it carried the weight of the blood spilled in the saloon. Smoke still lingered faintly in the rafters, curling upward in thin threads from the gunpowder that had choked the room hours before. The widows and I had stayed there through the night, not out of choice, but necessity. Their hands had been steady in the fight, but as the minutes crawled past and the reality of what they'd done pressed down, I could see the steel in their eyes begin to soften, not with regret, but with exhaustion, the kind that only comes when a war you've carried for years finally bursts out in gunfire. I sat at the table, the cards still scattered in front of me, though they no longer looked like games. They looked like tombstones, each one marking a death, a sin unburied. The younger widow leaned against my shoulder, her damp hair brushing my jawline as she dozed for the first time in what must have been days. The older widow sat opposite us, her arms folded tight across her chest, watching the door like she was waiting for it to open again, waiting for more men to come through. She didn't trust the quiet. Neither did I. The sheriff would come, I knew that much. This was a small town, and men like the one we'd killed didn't just vanish without stirring the hornet's nest. He was a collector, a bully wrapped in law's shadow, and even if the law hadn't sanctioned his cruelty, it had turned its head and let him thrive. Which meant when word spread of his death, the law would find its teeth again, and they'd come looking for whoever pulled the trigger. But for now, there was only the three of us, and the stillness, and the sound of the rainwater dripping from the eaves outside. When the younger widow stirred awake, her hand curled around my arm as if she thought I might vanish if she let go. She whispered, her voice raw and cracked from the night before, "It's not over." The older widow's eyes never left the door. "It never is." I thought of leaving, thought of saddling my horse and riding out before the sun reached high enough to bring heat to the mud-soaked street. But the thought died quickly. I was bound to them now, not just because of what had happened, but because of what it meant. Their fight had become mine, whether I wanted it or not. Later, when the saloon finally emptied of smoke and the oil lamps had burned low, we walked together back into the daylight. The mud sucked at our boots, and the townsfolk watched from behind curtains and half-closed doors, whispers crawling across the street like snakes. The widows walked tall despite the eyes on them. They weren't the broken women the town had pitied anymore. They were something else now, dangerous, alive, and unashamed. At their home, the air was thick with dust and memories. The younger widow's house still smelled faintly of her husband's tobacco, though the pipe on the shelf hadn't been lit since he was buried. The older widow moved about the kitchen like she'd never stopped, though every movement was deliberate, as if she were trying to cling to some sense of normal. She poured coffee, her hands finally shaking now that the adrenaline had worn off. We sat around the table, and it was then I saw the papers again. Not just the dead notices, but land deeds, contracts, letters from banks in far-off cities with signatures written by men who would never set foot in this town yet claimed to own every inch of it. I realized their fight wasn't just about revenge or even survival. It was about freedom, about clawing back something that had been stolen long before their husbands died. The younger widow pushed the papers toward me. "They'll take everything. The farm, the house, the land. They don't care we're alone. They count on it." I looked at the red stamps, the heavy ink that marked their lives like scars. "And last night?" I asked. The older widow's voice cut through the room. "Last night was a beginning. But men like him don't work alone. He was just one hand of the body. Cut it off, and another grows back." I leaned back in my chair, the weight of it pressing against me. "So what do you plan to do?" The younger widow's eyes met mine, and for the first time I saw not just grief or vengeance, but something fiercer. We planned to finish it. That was the moment I knew there was no turning back. Days passed in a blur of planning, whispers in the dark, and stolen glances that burned hotter than any lantern. At night, we sat together in their house, the storm outside replaced by the storm inside. They were fire and thunder, each in their own way. The younger widow burned with reckless heat, throwing herself into every moment as if tomorrow would steal her breath. The older widow was steadier, her fire deep and controlled, a slow burn that could consume a man whole without him realizing it until he was ash. Together, they drew me in, tangled me in their grief, their hunger, their desire. But outside those walls, the town began to shift. Men in black coats arrived, riding hard from the north. They didn't wear badges, but they didn't need to. Everyone knew what they were. Collectors, guns for hire, the next hand of the body the older widow had spoken of. They prowled the saloon, the streets, asking questions in voices that weren't questions at all. One night, I sat across from them at the poker table, the same table where everything had begun. The cards in my hand felt heavier, not because of the stakes of the game, but because of the eyes on me. One of the men leaned close, his breath thick with whiskey. "We hear you've been keeping company with a pair of widows," he said, his lips twisting into a smile that wasn't a smile. "Dangerous thing, that. Men die around them." I didn't flinch, didn't give him the satisfaction of fear. I laid my cards down, a straight flush, and gathered the pot. "Men die around you too," I said. "Difference is, nobody mourns." The table went quiet, the kind of quiet that comes before violence. My hand brushed the revolver at my side, and I felt the tension snap like a wire pulled too tight. But before blood could spill again, the saloon doors swung open, and there they were. The widows, stepping inside with their heads held high, their dresses simple but their presence commanding the room. Every eye turned to them, and the men at the table stiffened. They walked to me without hesitation, one on each side, their hands brushing mine, their touch deliberate, claiming me before the whole town. It was a bold move, reckless even, but it sent the message clear. We weren't hiding, we weren't afraid. That night, in the safety of their home, we spoke of what was coming. The younger widow pressed close, her whispers hot against my ear, not just of desire but of resolve. "They'll come for us," she said. "When they do, we'll be ready." And so we prepared. We gathered what little ammunition we could, cleaned the guns until they gleamed in the lantern light, and mapped out every corner of the town where a fight might break. The widows moved with precision, their grief sharpened into blades. They had lost everything once. They would not lose again. The night it happened, the air was still, too still, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The men came at dawn, their boots striking the mud in rhythm, their guns drawn. The sheriff was with them, though his eyes were downcast, his badge tarnished, his will broken. He was there because he had no choice, because men with money had pulled his strings too tight to cut. We met them in the street, the widows on either side of me, the sun rising behind us and painting the sky in fire. Words were exchanged, threats hissed through clenched teeth, but words had no weight now. Only bullets did. The fight was fast, brutal, and unforgiving. Gunfire cracked through the morning, smoke rising in clouds that choked the street. The widows moved like shadows, each shot precise, each step sure. I fought beside them, the rhythm of the battle a dark dance that bound us tighter than any oath could. When it was over, the street was littered with bodies, the silence broken only by the ragged breaths of the living. The sheriff lay wounded but alive, his badge in the dirt beside him. The men who had come to collect were gone, their power broken, their hold on the town shattered. The widows stood tall, their dresses torn, their hands stained with gunpowder and blood. They looked not like victims, not like women broken by loss, but like queens of a kingdom carved out of fire and ruin. I looked at them then, truly looked, and understood the shocking truth of it all. They hadn't just survived, they had transformed, forged into something unbreakable by the very hands that had tried to destroy them. And I was no longer just a wanderer, no longer just a man passing through. I was part of them now, bound by blood, by desire, by the storm we had weathered together. And as the town watched from behind shattered windows and broken doors, I knew the story of the widows, and the man who stood with them, was only just beginning. The town didn't breathe for days after the gunfight. Smoke still clung to the boards of the saloon, and the echoes of gunfire seemed to linger in the mud of the street, like the earth itself remembered the violence. Word spread faster than the morning light, reaching every corner of the county. The widows were no longer whispers, no longer just tragic stories told over whiskey. They were legends now, names spoken with equal parts awe and fear, two women who had stood against a gang of hired guns and walked away alive. And me, I was tied to them now in every mouth that told the tale, though the versions twisted depending on who spoke them. Some said I was their protector, others that I was their hired gun, and more still claimed I was bewitched, a fool caught between two sirens whose hunger could devour any man. The truth was stranger than all of it. The widows did not hide. That was the most startling thing to the town. Most expected them to run, to pack what little they had and flee before more men came to collect what they claimed was theirs. But they stayed. They walked the streets in daylight, their shoulders back, their eyes forward. They spoke to the shopkeepers. They bought food and fabric. They held themselves like they belonged there more than anyone else. And with every step, the town began to shift. Fear loosened its grip. The same men and women who had once pitied them now started looking at them differently. With respect, with hope. But respect is not safety. Hope is not protection. We knew more men would come. Debt collectors do not forgive. Banks do not forget. The storm was only gathering strength, and each day we lived in its shadow, waiting for the thunder. I spent those days working the land with them, hands calloused from fixing fences, tending to the soil, and repairing the damage years of neglect and loss had left behind. The younger widow moved quickly, her energy boundless, always the first to rise with the dawn. She would laugh in the fields, even when her hands blistered, even when sweat soaked her dress, as if daring life to beat her down again. The older widow was slower, steadier, her movements measured, but her wisdom guided every decision we made. She knew the soil, the weather, the ways of the town better than anyone. Between the two of them, they kept me working from dawn to dusk, and though my muscles ached and my back burned, I welcomed it. It was honest labor, far from the whiskey-soaked tables and bloody streets that had defined too much of my life. At night, though, honesty gave way to something else. The storms inside their house were fiercer than any that raged outside. Desire tangled with grief, and grief tangled with rage, until the three of us were caught in a fire that consumed the darkness. The younger widow was reckless, pulling me close with a hunger that left no room for breath. The older widow was slower, deliberate, savoring every touch as if it were both punishment and salvation. Between them, I was undone, claimed not by one but by both, and though it should have torn me apart, it bound me tighter to them. Shocking, terrifying even, the way they wove me into their grief, their vengeance, their survival. I was no longer just myself. I was theirs, and they were mine, and in that dangerous bond, we found a kind of peace. But peace never lasted. It was a week after the gunfight when the next storm came. The sheriff arrived at the farm, his badge polished as if to convince himself of its worth, his eyes weary. He wasn't alone. A man rode with him, dressed finer than any rancher or outlaw, his coat long and black, his hat pristine, his boots clean despite the mud. His mustache was trimmed sharp, his hands soft, and his eyes glittered with something colder than steel. He introduced himself as Mr. Whitlock, a representative of the bank. His voice was smooth, too smooth, like oil. Poured over rock. "I'm here to resolve this unpleasant business," he said as he sat at the kitchen table, spreading papers across the wood like a gambler laying out cards. His smile was thin, polite, and cruel. "I hear you've had some trouble. Unfortunate. But debts don't vanish with trouble. $800 is owed, and $800 will be paid. By coin or by land." The younger widow's eyes flashed with anger, but the older widow's hand touched hers, steadying her. She looked at Whitlock with a calm that was more dangerous than rage. "We paid," she said. "We paid with blood." Whitlock smiled wider, as if amused. "Ah, but not to me. You killed a collector. True, but that man was a contractor. Replaceable. You cannot kill a debt. It lingers, grows. That's the brilliance of it." He tapped the papers with a manicured finger. "I will give you a choice. Leave now, surrender the land, and you will not be hunted. Stay, and you will be destroyed." I leaned forward, my hand resting near the revolver on the table. You send men with guns, we'll send them back in the dirt. Whitlock's eyes slid to me, calm and unshaken. Ah, the hired hand. Or perhaps the lover. Either way, you'll be buried with them. My reach is long, stranger. Longer than your temper, longer than your bullets. Consider that when you make your choice. The sheriff said nothing. He stared at the floor, shame etched into every line of his face. He was a puppet in Whitlock's hand, powerless and broken. I almost pitied him. Almost. When Whitlock left, the widows and I sat in silence, the weight of his words pressing down. We knew then this wasn't just about the farm, or the debt, or even survival. This was war, not just against the men who came with guns, but against the system that fed them, the banks that squeezed the life from every farmer, every rancher, every widow. Whitlock wasn't wrong. Debts outlived men. But what he didn't know was that vengeance did too. We began to plan. We couldn't outpay them, couldn't outrun them, so we would outfight them, outthink them. The younger widow suggested burning the dead records, storming the bank itself, destroying the papers that chained them. The older widow thought of alliances, of gathering others who had suffered under Whitlock's hand, uniting the broken and the desperate into something stronger. I listened, weighed their words, and found myself agreeing with both. We would need fire and strategy, fury and patience. The nights grew longer as we plotted, and the bond between us grew sharper. I watched the widows transform before my eyes. They were no longer just women clawing for survival. They were leaders, visionaries, warriors. They inspired not only me but those around them. Farmers began stopping by the farm, offering food, bullets, horses. Men and women who had been silent for too long began to speak, to share their stories, their losses, their debts. Whitlock had built his empire on fear, but now fear was cracking, crumbling under the weight of defiance. The first strike was small, but it sent a message. One night, under the cover of darkness, we rode into town, torches in hand. The bank's outpost on the edge of town was guarded by two men, both half asleep, both too confident. They never saw us coming. The fire spread quickly, devouring the wood and paper inside. By morning, the building was ash, and the townsfolk whispered of rebellion. Whitlock arrived days later, his calm demeanor cracking as he surveyed the ruins. He doubled the guards, tripled the patrols, but the damage was done. The widows had shown the town that Whitlock could bleed. Retaliation came swift and brutal. Gunmen rode to the farm, 6 of them, armed and ready. The fight was fierce, the air thick with gunpowder and smoke. The younger widow fought like a storm unleashed, fearless, wild, her rifle steady even as bullets whistled past her head. The older widow was calmer, every shot deliberate, every move precise. I fought beside them, and together we turned the field into a graveyard. But victory cost us. The barn burned, the crops trampled, and the message was clear. Whitlock would not stop. He would burn the world around us to see us broken. In the quiet after the battle, as we buried the dead and salvaged what we could, I saw the weight pressing on the widows. They were strong, yes, but they were human, and the fight was carving pieces out of them. That night, as we lay together in the dim light of the lantern, the younger widow whispered, her voice trembling, "What if we can't win?" I pulled her close, my hand steady on her back. "Then we burn it all. We make sure they never forget we were here." The older widow's eyes met mine, steady and unflinching. "We will win, not because we're stronger, not because we're smarter, but because we have nothing left to lose. That makes us unstoppable." And so we fought on. Each skirmish, each fire, each act of defiance pushed Whitlock closer to rage. The town began to rise with us, slow at first, then faster, emboldened by each victory. Farmers armed themselves, shopkeepers refused payments, the saloon became a place of planning instead of despair. The widows stood at the heart of it, their names whispered like prayers, their presence a beacon in the dark. But Whitlock was not a man to be cornered without striking back. He brought in more men, hardened killers from the cities, men who had spilled blood for less than coin. They came armed with rifles, dynamite, and cruelty. The final confrontation was inevitable, and we knew it. The widows and I spent the last night before it together, holding each other in silence, knowing dawn would bring fire and blood. When the sun rose, the battle began. The streets of the town became war zones, bullets tearing through wood and flesh alike. The widows fought at my side, their courage unshakable, their aim deadly. Townsfolk rose beside us, fighting with whatever they had: guns, knives, even pitchforks. The air was filled with screams, smoke, and the thunder of gunfire. Whitlock himself stood at the heart of it, his fine clothes stained with dust, his calm shattered, his eyes wild with desperation. He screamed orders, fired blindly, but his empire was crumbling around him. The widows advanced together, their guns blazing, their fury unstoppable. And as Whitlock fell, clutching his chest, his empire died with him. The town was free. The debts were ash. The widows stood victorious, their names etched into history not as victims, not as tragedies, but as legends. And I stood with them, bound forever to the fire they had lit. The dust had barely settled when the silence of the battlefield pressed down on us like a weight. Bodies littered the street, some familiar, some strangers who had ridden in with Whitlock's promise of coin. The saloon windows were shattered, the sheriff's office riddled with holes, and smoke curled from the church roof where dynamite had gone off too close. The widows stood with me in the center of it all, their guns lowered, their faces streaked with dirt and blood, but their eyes unbroken. Around us, the townsfolk began to emerge from doorways and alleys, stepping over the dead, tending to the wounded, and staring at us as though we were something more than human. The younger widow dropped her rifle to the ground, her chest heaving, her hands trembling just enough to betray how much the fight had taken from her. The older widow rested a hand on her shoulder, steadying her, though I could see the exhaustion in her too. They had given everything, and yet something told me this wasn't the end. Whitlock was gone, yes, but men like him were like weeds. They grew back in different forms, stronger if the roots were not burned out. The sheriff limped toward us, hat in his hands, his badge tarnished and bent from a stray bullet. He couldn't look me in the eye, nor the widows. "It's done," he muttered, voice hollow. "Lord help us, it's done." But the older widow shook her head. "No, this was just the first. Others will come when they hear Whitlock's gone. They'll want to take his place. They'll want to take what's ours." The sheriff's shoulders sagged. He knew she was right, but he had no fight left in him. He shuffled away, useless as ever, leaving us to shoulder the burden he should have carried. We walked back to the farm in silence that night, the moonlight casting long shadows across the burned barn, the trampled fields, the broken fence lines. It wasn't just a home anymore, it was a fortress in a war we hadn't asked for but could never walk away from. The younger widow slumped against the porch post, staring out into the dark with eyes that had seen too much blood. I sat beside her, lighting a cigarette, the smoke curling between us. "You think it's over?" she asked, her voice rough, nearly swallowed by the wind. I took a long drag before answering. "No, it'll never be over. Men like Whitlock don't fight for land or coin alone. They fight because they believe they own the world. And there's always another man ready to wear the crown when one falls." The older widow stepped onto the porch, carrying a lantern, her face half shadow, half light. "Then we don't wait for them to come. We take the fight to them." Her words struck deep. For the first time, I realized she wasn't just thinking of the farm, or even the town. She was thinking bigger, of tearing out the roots, of dismantling the system that had crushed her, crushed all of us. And when her eyes met mine, I saw it there, the fire of someone who had nothing left to lose and everything left to fight for. The weeks that followed were uneasy. The town was rebuilding, patching bullet holes, burying the dead, trying to return to some semblance of life. But an undercurrent ran through every conversation, every meeting in the saloon, every hushed whisper by the well. People were looking to the widows now. To me, too, though I never asked for it. They saw us not just as survivors but as leaders, as proof that the chains could be broken if enough blood was spilled. The widows began to gather those willing to fight. Farmers came with rifles passed down from the war, blacksmiths with hammers, women with pistols hidden in skirts. We trained in the fields, shot at tin cans, practiced riding in formation. The younger widow grew fiercer each day, her laughter edged with steel, her hands quick on the trigger. The older widow became the strategist, drawing maps, studying supply lines, teaching patience when recklessness threatened to undo us. And me, I became their bridge, holding them together when the fire between them threatened to burn too hot. when grief and desire pulled them in different directions. One night, as we sat around a fire in the barn's ruins, a rider came from the west, his horse lathered, his face pale. He spoke of another banker, another man with Whitlock's ambition, moving in fast to claim the ashes of his empire. His name was Caraway, and unlike Whitlock, he wasn't content to bleed a single town dry. He wanted the whole territory. He had men, money, and the backing of rail barons who saw every acre of land as nothing but steel and profit. The widows listened in silence, their faces hardening with each word. When the rider left, the younger widow spat into the fire. Another vulture. The older widow's gaze shifted to me. No, a wolf. Whitlock was small, greedy, arrogant. Caraway is something else. If he plants roots here, no one will stand a chance. And so, the war grew larger. We rode out in small bands, striking at Caraway's supply wagons, ambushing his hired guns on lonely trails, burning the camps he tried to set up near town. Each victory was costly, each fight bloodier than the last. The younger widow thrived in the chaos, fearless to the point of recklessness, sometimes scaring even me with how much she hungered for the fight. The older widow tempered her, always pulling her back from the edge, but I could see the cracks forming in both of them. The toll of constant war was heavy, even if they refused to admit it. There were nights when the three of us collapsed together in the farmhouse, too tired to speak, our bodies tangled not just in passion but in desperation. We clung to each other like shipwrecked sailors, knowing the sea would never stop trying to drown us. Sometimes I wondered if what bound us was love or simply survival, but in those moments it didn't matter. It was enough. Caraway's reach spread faster than we could strike. He brought more men, tougher, better armed, men who had seen war and carried it in their eyes. He built alliances with crooked sheriffs, bought judges, and sent preachers to whisper promises of order and prosperity if only the people would fall in line. He wasn't like Whitlock, blind with greed. He was clever, patient, dangerous. The breaking point came when he sent his men to the farm in the dead of night. Not 6 this time, not a handful, but dozens. They came with torches and rifles, surrounding the house, shouting promises of mercy if we surrendered. But we knew better. There was no mercy in men like Caraway. Only chains or coffins. The fight that night was like nothing before. Gunfire ripped through the dark, the flames of torches casting twisted shadows across the walls. The younger widow fought at the window, her rifle spitting fire into the night, her laughter wild even as bullets shattered the wood around her. The older widow commanded the defense with a general's calm, shouting orders, moving from room to room with a pistol in each hand. I held the doorway, cutting down any who came close, my ears ringing, my body numb with the rhythm of death. We held them off until dawn, the ground outside littered with bodies, the air thick with smoke. But the farm was gone. The house was half burned, the fields destroyed, the animals slaughtered. We stood in the ruins, bruised, bloodied, alive but broken. It was then the townsfolk came. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, carrying rifles, axes, knives. They had seen the flames from miles away, heard the gunfire, and come running. For the first time, they weren't afraid. For the first time, they were ready to fight not just for survival but for freedom. The widows stood before them, ragged and fierce, their hair wild, their clothes torn, their eyes blazing. And the people listened. They pledged themselves not to Caraway, not to fear, but to the widows. To us. From that day, the war wasn't ours alone. It belonged to everyone. And as the sun rose over the smoking ruins of the farm, I knew there was no turning back. This was no longer about debt, or land, or vengeance. This was about tearing down the empire of men like Caraway and Whitlock, about building something new from the ashes. The widows didn't ask for that role, but it was theirs now. And I was bound to them, through blood, through fire, through a love as fierce and dangerous as the war itself. And so the story went on, the war stretching across the land, the widows, names growing louder with each battle, until even Caraway himself began to fear the shadows of 2 women who refused to bow, who refused to break, who refused to be forgotten. The farm was smoke and ash, but the people who gathered there gave it new life. Men with their sleeves rolled up, women with their hair tied back, even children carrying buckets of water or scraps of wood for fires. They came not just from town but from the outlying ranches, the forgotten homesteads, the places Caraway's greed had already begun to touch. For years they had bent under the weight of men like him. Now, standing in the shadow of the burned house, listening to the widow speak, they found something they had lost, something that had been stolen from them one dead at a time. Hope. The younger widow's voice carried over the crowd, sharp and raw. You've all felt it. The weight, the noose around your neck. Whitlock wore the crown here, and now Caraway thinks he can take it. But they don't own us. Not this land, not our sweat, not our lives. We proved that tonight. We bled, but we stood. And if we stand together, we'll never bow again. The crowd erupted, fists in the air, shouts rising like thunder. The older widow let them roar before lifting her hands, steadying them with her calm. Her words were slower, but they cut deeper. There will be more blood. You know it. Caraway will not stop, but we will not stop either. We fight not for gold, not for pride, but for the right to breathe free. If you stand with us, you stand for your children, and their children after them. No more widows, no more orphans, no more chains. I watched their faces as they listened, saw the fire in their eyes, the steel forming in their spines. They weren't farmers anymore, not tonight. They were soldiers, an army, rough and untrained, but bound by something stronger than coin or fear. When the speeches ended, the planning began. We couldn't stay at the farm. It was too exposed, too ruined to defend again. So we moved into the hills, building camps out of canvas and wood, using caves and gulches as hideouts. The widows led every step, one with fire, the other with strategy, and I rode between them, binding the pieces together. Scouts patrolled the roads, messengers carried word to far-off homesteads, and blacksmiths worked day and night to hammer out bullets and blades. It was a rebellion now, no mistaking it, and Caraway felt the tremors long before he saw the storm. His answer was swift. He sent mercenaries into the hills, men hardened by war in the south, killers who knew ambush and fire as well as any outlaw. But what he didn't know was that we had turned the land itself into our ally. We knew the gullies, the hidden trails, the choke points where a few rifles could cut down dozens. The first bands of mercenaries never made it back. Their guns, their horses, their supplies became ours. And the legend of the widow spread. Further, still, Caraway was patient. He didn't just send men, he sent whispers. He offered gold for betrayal, safety for surrender. A few broke under the weight of fear or greed, and for a while we bled for it. Camps burned in the night, scouts were found with throats cut. Each betrayal hit the younger widow hardest. Rage boiled in her, made her reckless, made her ride out alone more than once, hunting ghosts that weren't there. The older widow kept her tether, but even she could not hold her completely. One night, after a raid that had nearly cost us everything, the younger widow stormed out of camp, rifle slung across her back, her breath ragged with fury. I followed her into the trees, the moonlight silver on her hair, her body shaking like a bowstring pulled too tight. They'll keep coming, she spat, pacing, her hands clenched. We kill one, another rises. We burn a camp, he builds 3 more. How long before we're all bones in the dirt? I stepped closer, catching her arm. She spun on me, eyes wild, and for a moment I thought she'd strike me. Then the fire broke, and she pressed herself against me, her fists pounding weakly against my chest before falling still. Her breath was hot against my neck. I can't lose again, she whispered. Not you, not her, not this. I held her, silent, because there were no words that could promise safety. All I could give her was the truth of my arms around her, the steadiness of my heartbeat. She kissed me hard, desperate, pulling me down into the grass, the night around us filled with the sound of her breaking and rebuilding at once. And when she finally slept, tangled against me, I lay awake staring at the stars, wondering how much more she could carry before she shattered. The older widow knew. She always knew. The next morning, she found me by the fire, her gaze heavy. She didn't ask, didn't need to. Instead, she placed her hand over mine. She burns too bright, she murmured. One day, it will consume her. You have to be ready. Her words cut me deeper than any blade, but I nodded. Because I had already seen it. As the weeks turned to months, the rebellion grew teeth. What began as scattered raids became organized strikes. We hit Caraway's rail shipments, stole his gold, freed prisoners from his jails. The territory buzzed with our presence, songs of the widows sung in saloons, their names etched into the wood of bar tables and carved into rifle stocks. Caraway answered with more brutality. Entire homesteads burned for sheltering us, men hanged from trees as warnings, women dragged to towns as hostages. His cruelty only fed our fire, but it also fed our losses. The breaking point came at Silver Gulch. Caraway sent 200 men, a small army by frontier standards, armed with repeating rifles and dynamite. We had barely half that number, but the widows refused to retreat. The gulch was narrow, the cliffs steep, and we used every inch to our advantage. The battle raged for hours, gunfire echoing like thunder, smoke thick in the air. The younger widow fought at the front, fearless, cutting down men as fast as they came. The older widow moved through the lines, steadying those who faltered, her voice carrying above the chaos like a bell. I remember the moment the younger widow fell. Not dead. Not then. But struck by a bullet that tore through her side. She staggered, blood soaking her dress, and for a heartbeat the fire in her eyes dimmed. I was at her side in an instant, dragging her back, my hands slick with her blood. She gritted her teeth, tried to rise, but the older widow pressed her down, her face pale but fierce. "You've done enough. Let me carry it now." And she did. The older widow led the final charge, her pistol empty, her knife flashing in the smoke. The men who lived swore they saw her eyes glowing like coals, her shadow towering larger than life. When the dust cleared, the gulch was ours, though the ground was soaked with blood. We carried the younger widow back to camp, her body feverish, her breath shallow. For days we hovered between life and death, the camp silent, every ear straining for her next breath. I sat by her side, sleepless, whispering promises into the dark, promises I had no right to make. And when her eyes finally opened, weak but burning, the camp erupted in cheers. She was alive, but something in her had changed. The wild fire was still there, but deeper now, tempered by the edge of death. She laughed less, spoke softer, but her resolve was iron. Caraway faltered after Silver Gulch. He had lost too many men, too much gold, too much control. His backers in the cities began to pull away, unwilling to pour more coin into a losing war. But he didn't vanish. No, men like him never did. He dug in, more desperate, more dangerous, a wolf cornered but still with teeth. And so we prepared for the final storm. Not because we wanted it, but because it was inevitable. The widows knew it, I knew it, every man and woman in the camp knew it. This was no longer about farms or debts. It was about tearing down the throne itself, shattering the crown that men like Whitlock and Caraway wore so easily. And as I stood with them in the glow of the campfire, the younger widow leaning on my arm, the older widow watching the horizon, I knew this was where I belonged. Not as a hero, not as a savior, but as part of something greater, something that might finally set the land free. The campfires burned low that night, their smoke curling into the sky like prayers too heavy to rise. We all knew it was the endgame. Caraway had gathered the remnants of his fortune, scraped together every loyal dog he had left, and fortified himself inside the old Whitlock estate, a sprawling mansion on the edge of town, built on blood, money and bone. For years it had been a monument to power, its tall windows glowing like watchful eyes. Now it was a fortress, bristling with rifles and men ready to die for the scraps of a king's table. The widows stood before the fire, their silhouettes etched against the flames. The younger one, pale but unbroken, leaned on her rifle like it was an extension of her spine. The older one, calm and steady, her face hard as stone, spoke quietly but firmly. "Tomorrow we end it. No more raids, no more running. Caraway falls, or we do. There is no third path." A silence followed, heavier than the mountains. Everyone knew she was right. And everyone, despite the fear clawing at their chests, nodded. For too long they had been prey. Tomorrow they would become hunters. That night, as the camp settled, the younger widow found me by the edge of the river. Her hand slipped into mine, fingers cold but steady. "If I don't make it," she whispered, "you'll take care of her, won't you?" Her words hit me like a bullet, and I turned to her sharply. "Don't speak like that. You're not going anywhere." She smiled faintly, her eyes reflecting the moonlight. "You always say that, and still the bullets fly." She leaned her head against my shoulder. "Promise me." I swallowed hard, because promises had become dangerous things in this war, but I gave it to her. She kissed me once, soft and lingering, then pulled away before I could say more. The older widow was waiting for her by the fire, and together they disappeared into the night. I stood there a long time, listening to the river, wondering how many dawns were left for any of us. When the sun rose, the world was fire. We marched on Whitlock's estate in silence, a tide of grim faces and clenched fists. The widows rode at the front, banners torn but flying, rifles gleaming in the light. As we crested the hill, the estate came into view, its white walls scarred with barricades, its gates chained and barred. Men lined the balconies, rifles trained, dynamite stacked like cordwood. Caraway had made his lair, and he meant to die in it if he had to. The first shot rang out before we reached the gates. It cracked across the field, and one of our men dropped, blood spraying across the grass. For a heartbeat, fear gripped the line, but then the younger widow raised her rifle, fired, and one of Caraway's gunmen toppled from the balcony. Her cry carried over the roar of the guns, pulling us forward. We charged. The battle was chaos, a storm of smoke and fire. The gates splintered under the weight of our charge, and the fight spilled into the courtyard. Rifles cracked, pistols roared, blades flashed in the haze. The younger widow fought like a storm given flesh, her wound forgotten, her fury unchained. The older one moved like a general, her commands cutting through the madness, keeping the tide from breaking. And I stayed close, carving a path through the blood and ruin, my only thought to keep them alive. Caraway appeared on the balcony above, dressed in a black coat, revolver in one hand, cigar clamped between his teeth. His voice boomed across the courtyard. "Fools, you think you can burn the crown? You think you can break the chain? You are nothing, ants beneath a boot." The younger widow raised her rifle, aimed, and fired. The bullet grazed his cheek, snapping his head back and tearing the cigar from his mouth. He staggered, then laughed, the sound cold and hollow. "Come then," he bellowed. "Come and take it." We fought our way inside, room by room, floor by floor. The estate was a labyrinth of polished wood now stained with blood. Caraway's men fell, but so did ours. Friends I had marched with for months crumpled at my side, their names swallowed by gunfire. Still we pressed on, the widows never faltering, their eyes fixed on the stairs that led to the heart of the beast. At the top of the grand staircase, Caraway waited. He had shed his coat, his sleeves rolled, his revolvers gleaming in both hands. His eyes were wild, but his stance was steady, a man who had killed more times than he could count. The widows flanked me, their weapons raised, and for a moment the world shrank to that single hallway, that single heartbeat before the storm. He fired first. The air split with the crack of his guns, bullets tearing splinters from the walls. We dove aside, returning fire, the hallway erupting in smoke. The younger widow screamed, charging forward, her rifle empty but her fury endless. Caraway swung his revolver toward her, but I leapt, tackling him hard. We crashed through a door, splintering into Whitlock's old study. The walls were lined with books, the desk still piled with ledgers, the weight of the crown etched in ink and greed. We fought like animals, fists and knives and fury. He was stronger, heavier, but I was faster, fueled by rage. Still, he slammed me against the desk, his hand closing around my throat. His eyes burned down into mine, and he hissed, "You'll die like the rest. And they'll kneel again, because they always kneel." The sound of a hammer cocking froze us both. The younger widow stood in the doorway, blood streaming down her face, her rifle raised. Behind her, the older widow entered, her pistol steady, her eyes colder than death. Caraway sneered, his grip tightening on my throat. "Do it then. Make widows of yourselves. Kill me, and another will rise. The crown is eternal." The older widow stepped closer, her voice calm. "No, the crown is just a man. And men bleed." They fired together. 2 shots, 1 heart. Caraway's eyes widened, his grip faltered, and he crumpled to the floor, the light gone from him. The study fell silent, save for the crackle of flames from the halls below. The crown was broken. We dragged his body outside, throwing it into the courtyard for all to see. The men who still lived dropped their weapons, their fight gone. The estate burned behind us, the sky black with smoke, the air thick with the end of an era. The widows stood at the gates, their hands clasped together, faces streaked with blood and ash. The people gathered, silent, watching as the symbol of their chains collapsed into fire. And then the younger widow raised her rifle high, her voice breaking the silence. No more kings, no more crowns. The roar that followed shook the earth. Men, women, children, all cried out as one, their voices carrying across the hills, a chorus that buried Caraway and Whitlock and every tyrant before them. It was over. In the days that followed, the estate's ruins became the foundation of something new. The land was divided, the debts burned, the chains broken. The widows were no longer widows but leaders, their names etched into the soil, into the hearts of the people. They ruled not with fear but with fire and wisdom, a balance of storm and stone. As for me, I stayed, not as their savior, not as their weapon, but as their shadow, their anchor, their equal. Together we rebuilt, together we healed, and together we dreamed of a land where no man's greed could choke the life from another. The younger widow never lost her fire, though it burned steadier now, tempered by scars and survival. The older one never lost her calm, though her eyes softened, her laughter returning in rare, precious moments. And me, I carried their story, not as legend, but as truth. Years later, when children asked about the day the crown burned, I told them what I had seen. Not the battles, not the blood, not the flames, but two women who refused to bow, who turned grief into fury, fury into strength, and strength into freedom. And when I lay awake at night, listening to their breaths beside me, I knew what Caraway never understood. The crown was not eternal, but what we had built, what we had bled for, was. Thank you so much for watching this story till the very end. Your support means more than words can ever say. If you felt the depth of this journey, don't forget to give it a like, share it with someone who needs it, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel. Together, we'll keep bringing powerful stories to life, and your presence here makes all the difference.